All right, so good morning. And so here we come to the first of the interpretations, or basically what I want you to be able to do in this course is really, I want you to be able to take confidence in your readings, your own readings of the material, whatever it might be. I understand that you may feel, but I don't have the history. It's like, yeah, I get that. But the thing is, we never have enough history to know, to be able to interpret really what's going on around us, which means that we can't just sit around and say, oh, well, I don't know what's happening. I guess I have to trust other people. It's like, no, no, you have to trust yourself. And so what I want you to do is learn that after all these years of being told that you don't know what you're doing, that actually you do know what you're doing. And that if you will put the skills that you've already got together uh, with some confidence in your reading and your ability to, by reading, I don't mean how you actually physically read, but that your readings, your interpretations of texts, that it's you will find that actually you can interpret and you do have lots of good ideas. Anyway, so more for that later. But so this is a little lecture about close reading a text. So we're just going to take a couple of stories and we're just going to focus on them as like what happens in these stories and how does it happen. So we'll just very, very simply go through some stuff so you can see it's like, oh, I actually know how to do that. But I've given us texts which are considered to be problem texts. That is, some texts are supposedly open and shut. Very few are really actually that clear. It takes a while for people to figure out what's going on in that. It can be most things around us are quite complex. All right, so what am I going to do? Well, we're going to go through this. This is sort of how I organize this lecture. I'll put myself up here so I don't break my so I don't break my neck. I'll go back for Christ's sakes. All right, here we go. So I'll give you a chance to pause me and make a note of the stuff if you wish. And okay, I'm unpaused. And so I'm back. I was buffering. And now, yeah, okay. So I'm going to start talking about confronting a problem text. All right. In this first section here, it's pretty much going to be me just talking. So, oh, the horror. Oh, no AV fun. Oh my goodness. No eye candy. When I talk about a problem text, what I mean is, and it can be anything. It can be a film, it can be a memoir, it can be a documentary, it can be a website, it can be a piece of news, it can be somebody's tweet. Like it can be an Instagram image, it can be huge, it can be tiny, it doesn't matter. It's like, what does it mean? There usually is, the problem I'm talking about is not so much whether we like it or not. It's not that. It's like, what does it mean? And what is the proper interpretation of this thing? And by proper interpretation, I don't mean what is an interpretation that the government likes, or what is an interpretation that you and your friends like, but what is an interpretation that you feel is just, that is accurate. So if I said, yeah, I don't know, let's say, I don't know, let's take some series like Fleabag or something like that. I don't know, or a movie you might have seen. What might you have seen? I don't know you yet. So tell me what you're seeing and tell me what you're watching. Let's say you saw the movie Joker. Okay, fine. Or I don't know. Let me find something else. But let's take Joker for the moment. And I say to you, well, Joker is really about the problem of race relations in Africa. And you're like, what? How did you get that? Like, maybe it could be maybe about race relations, although it's so clearly about gender. But in Africa, it's like, oh, because, and I would argue it. It's like, well, really, how did you get that? How did you get to that interpretation? Okay, so, well, that's the question. It's like, how did you get to this interpretation? How did you come to it? And how do you know that an interpretation is wrong? And how can you prove it? Because people will say, well, that's how I see it. You're like, well, I'm not anybody to tell you no. I mean, if you think that's what it's about, that's what it's about. If you think Happy Birthday to You is really a funeral dirge, it's like, okay, who am I to say? Every time you sing Happy Birthday to You, you're really marking off another year closer to death. It's like, yeah, you can see where it's like, yeah, Happy Birthday is the saddest song in the world. It's like, Okay, I don't think that's the way it's intended. And that's exactly it. And somebody would say, that's not its intention. Okay. So the questions that I've just sort of, you know, put out in sort of balloons, bunch of balloons there, released them, is, take up things like, what does the thing mean? So what does the text mean? Is it worth your time? This is always sort of an issue. Does it tell you the truth? And what do you mean by that? Like it's such a massively loaded term. Will you believe it? I mean, if you see a text and you think, yeah, I think that's the truth, but maybe you won't believe it. Maybe you'll resist it. Maybe you'll say, no, I don't believe it. It's too horrible to believe, or I don't believe the politics. And why will you believe it? What's going to convince you? What is it that convinced you that this was real? So some stories have more at stake in them. There's like a story in court, for instance, has an enormous amount at stake. It may mean that a person is going to spend time in jail. It may mean that the state would like to kill somebody. It may mean that one parent or the other will get full custody of children. The stakes can be enormously high. These are all interpretations about basically what's the right interpretation. And the courtroom is a place where there has to be a winner, despite the fact that the thing may go through appeals. Still, the idea is at the end of the day, at the point the case arrives at the Supreme Court, the question is, well, who is the winner? There will have to be a winner. It's not that, as a great professor of mine used to say, that all will have won and all shall have prizes. Not everybody gets to be a winner. So when it comes to war stories, the stakes are very high indeed, because people's lives were tied up in them. People often died in them. And then people's lives, the survivors, have been probably indelibly marked by the war. So when somebody tells a war story, it's like, well, what does that mean? Often when we talk about, somebody says, well, after that, we were just telling war stories. It's kind of like what they used to call fishing stories. It's like, I got a fish, it was this big. And every time you tell the story, it's bigger. Well, when you tell war stories, and veterans often talk about this, and they'll say, well, they were just telling war stories, which means that basically people were just sort of saying what they wanted to say to reassure themselves, to make themselves feel okay about a terrible situation. So telling a war story doesn't mean necessarily that you're telling the most important story that there ever was. In this culture, though, war stories are given a great importance, enormously. And they're not just life and death stories, but they also set patterns for how peoples and nations will go to war, and will go to war in the future, and why a war is just or unjust, why it's worth fighting or not worth fighting. So when Tim O'Brien, who was a foot soldier in Vietnam, was drafted and sent to Vietnam, writes in the middle of one of his books about war. He has famously written, his most famous books are about war. On page 64, he says, this is true. We have a problem, because he doesn't say this on page 1 of the book. He says this on page 64 of the book. It's like, well, what has he been doing so far? Lying to us? Why does he need to say on page 64, oh, the stuff I'm going to tell you now, that's the true stuff? It's like, wait, stop. So up until this point, you've been entertaining me? Like what? I mean, it's been entertaining, all right, but what? So I've asked you to read these stories because they are a good place to start with looking at and playing with complex narrative puzzles. And what I want you to remember about these puzzles is that they're puzzles. They also have truths in them, but the truths are going to be ones that likely you extract. The author will have put in things that she or he is after. Whether you get those things is something else entirely, right? What you take away from the story is, we can't know, because we don't know who you are. And as we each reader is a different reader. So O'Brien formulates, this is a very famous story, this How to Tell a True War Story. And all the stories in this book the things they carried are very famous. But this one is particularly famous, and it has this formulation about truth in war on page 65, which is in the course pack. A true war story is never moral. It does not instruct, nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing the things men have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. If at the end of a war story you feel uplifted, or if you feel that some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger waste, then you have been made a victim of a very old and terrible lie. There is no rectitude whatsoever. There is no virtue. As a first rule of thumb, therefore, you can tell a true war story by its absolute and uncompromising allegiance to obscenity and evil. This is page 65. So we have to then go back and say, all right, if we, according to O'Brien's rules here, because he's laying down rules about, say, what makes a truth in a story, that if we come away feeling, well, I really love those soldiers, and it's like, whoa, we got a problem, according to O'Brien. Or if we come away thinking that was a just cause, gee, I wish I could go to war, which we'll see, texts like this, then we have got a problem, according to O'Brien. Okay, I am now at 2 chronologies, and so I will give us a break here.